Thanks, Tony. Go ahead and share my screen. How does it look, Tony?
Looks good.
Okay, thanks. Good evening, everyone. As Tony mentioned, tonight we're going to be talking about wildfire in Wisconsin as part of our Learn About Your Land series. Specifically tonight, we're going to talk about some tips to help you protect your home and property. And we have a couple topics to go over. So I'm going to start by talking about wildfire risk in the state broadly, and then focus in on figuring out if your home or property is at risk. Next, I'm going to go over how homes ignite to give you a better idea and understanding of the ways that some of these risks can play out on a piece of land. And then last, we're going to talk about things you can do to prepare both your home and property for wildfire. So why do we want to talk about wildfire in Wisconsin? Our recent data from the DNR show that between 2009 and 2018, we have an annual average of just over 900 fires that burn about 2,600 acres. And the interesting thing about that number is that DNR land only covers about 50% of the state. So those numbers are actually lower than the fires that we do experience in Wisconsin. And over 98%, so almost 100% of these fires are caused by everyday people. Some of the ways that wildfires are started are in this pie chart on the right side. And if you look closely, you'll see debris burning is 35%, and equipment is another 24%, making those the two most common causes of wildfire in the state. And I was actually just told by Andy and Jolene that ash disposal is a pretty high, one of the higher reasons as well. But all that to be said, if you look at the pie chart, most of these wildfire causes have to do with humans. So the only one that really doesn't have to do with us is what's called other, which is 7%, which could still involve humans. So now that we've talked about kind of an annual average and some of the causes, let's talk about what has happened this year as far as wildfire. So this week, we've only had a few, about 6, which makes sense. We're kind of out of the spring fire season. We're getting into summer. The vegetation outside, the grasses and the trees, everything is green and beautiful. But if we keep looking back, let's look at 2020 as a whole. So far, we've had 439 fires in the state, and each one of those little icons is a wildfire that has happened this year. And something that I want to point out is some of these areas you don't see a lot of fire icons, and that doesn't mean that they haven't happened there or that they can't happen. It just means that they haven't happened in that area this year. And another important thing to point out is some of these areas you can see some pretty high densities of fire. And the reason you're seeing this is similar to the numbers that I just presented. So this data only reflects the DNR protected land. So this does not include the other approximate 50% of the state. So there are more fires that are happening, they just aren't in this data set. Okay, so that's what we're looking at as far as 2020. We've had about 439. 2019, we had about 708 fires. So does that mean that more fires happened last year than this year? Not necessarily. We're going to get into some of the seasonal reasons why fires occur, but the main one is that there are 2 main fire seasons, spring and fall. So this year we haven't had fall yet, which means later this year, fall comes around, the vegetation starts dying and people start burning again. We will have some more fires. So this graphic will look more like the 2020 graphic. The 2020 will look more like this graphic. And I want to point out this data set. if you go to the main DNR website and type in wildfire activity in the search bar, you can look at any of these data sets, but you can also look at things related to prescribed fire and burning permits and burning restrictions. And with that, Andy, I think you wanted to talk a little bit about the things on the website that folks can learn more about restrictions and permits.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for attending tonight, guys, folks. I'm going to talk a little bit about a burning permit. So in Wisconsin, you need a burning permit any time of the year other than when it's completely snow covered, and the snow will be there throughout the duration of your burn. So basically, the wintertime is the only time of year you probably wouldn't need a burning permit. So you need to have a permit in order to start your fire, but there's a few other things you need to do as well. You can get a permit right from the DNR website, WisBurn, or you can go to your local fire warden and they can issue a burn permit, or you can stop by a DNR office and they will issue a burn permit. However, there's a few other things you need to do once you have the permit. Prior to starting your fire, you should check on the website, WisBurn, or call the 1-800 number on your burning permit and check to see what times they're allowing burning and if they're allowing burning at all on the permit. So I kind of a interesting story. Friday, I had just got home from the woods and got a call from our sheriff's department dispatch saying that somebody was burning in one of the towns in Florence County. Took a ride out there and the guy was burning tires and other non-acceptable materials. So the materials that are acceptable to burn are clean wood, leaves, grass clippings, things like that, things you would find in nature. Well, this fella had tires and carpeting and building supplies. And so when I talked to him, he did acknowledge he had a permit, but he acknowledged he hadn't called the number to find out when he could burn. Well, come to find out, burning was not allowed that day until 6 p.m. until 12 a.m. that night. And so that's just a good example of making sure that you know what you're doing prior to starting your fire. All right, we can go to the next slide unless you have something to add.
No, thanks, Andy. So we mentioned that there are 2 fire seasons, and Andy's going to talk a little bit about the seasons and how they impact wildfires.
Okay, so our biggest fire season is in the spring of the year. And in the county I'm in Florence County, our fire staffing usually starts around mid-April and goes until around Memorial Day, maybe a little longer than that. It's, again, the most critical fire season in Wisconsin is the spring. It's that way because things are we still have a bunch of dead material on the ground, fine fuels. Our relative humidities are low, and you get winds, and it just makes for temperatures start warming up, and it makes for the right mix for things to start on fire. Summertime, at least in Florence County, we don't usually get staffed during the summertime. However, during some drought times like in July or August, when we haven't got much rain, things are really warm, the humidity levels might fluctuate. It is possible for a firework or some logging equipment or a car pulling a load up a hill or something to cause a ditch fire, in which we would be called out to put it out. Fall time is another time that we could have fires because our leaves are falling off the trees, things are drying up. The fine fuels are drying and dying for the year, and that's another good time to have fires. a lot of times falls are wet, at least up in the northeast part of the state, and so we don't see many fires, but um, some areas of the state do receive fires in the fall. And wintertime is usually the best time to burn because the state is usually snow covered. Um, However, one of the biggest causes of fires in the wintertime is ash disposal from a wood burning stove, and the ashes don't necessarily go out because they're in snow. They can persist for a long time and then end up causing a fire in late winter or early spring. Um, so again, spring is the most critical time to be cautious of what you're doing when you're burning your debris. Make sure you have a permit and make sure it's the right time to burn.
And Andy, do folks need a permit in the fall as well?
Yes, a permit in most counties are required where DNR has fire responsibility any time of the year except for when it's completely snow covered.
Okay.
And Andy, if I could just jump in, we had a question in the chat box about whether there are any consequences for burning prohibited items and what happens to people when they get caught burning prohibited things.
So from my example I used on Friday, this fellow was issued a citation. The citation wasn't for burning prohibited things. It was for burning during an off-peak time. But you can, we can forward that on to hazmat and have them come in and check out what they were burning and make them clean that site as well.
Thanks, Tony. All right, let's move on. Oops. And then Andy is going to touch on some other challenges associated with wildfire and firefighting.
So when we have a fire, the DNR is dispatched as well as the local volunteer fire departments in our communities. Usually, the volunteer fire department, because they're spread out in Florence County, we work with 4 to 5 different fire departments, so they're more spread out than we are as a DNR, so they can usually respond quicker. But again, we do trainings with them to keep them abreast on wildfire situations, but they're trained for structural firefighting. So our response time, could be as long as 15 to 20 minutes to get to a fire, dependent on where they are in the county. We do have good water resources in this state. That's not really an issue for us to be able to have unlimited water. It just takes a little more time in rural communities to set up a pump system in rivers or lakes. But we do have limited resources. We're limited to the equipment our volunteers have. The equipment we have is DNR staff, and just manpower, because these folks are volunteers. They don't have to show up to help fight the fires, but in my experience, they're all a good group of folks, and they do their best to get there in a timely manner.
Thanks, Andy. And all of these challenges that Andy just talked about are some of the reasons that we want to talk to you tonight about having your house and your property prepared, especially for those of you that live in the more rural areas where response times may be maybe higher. So let's get into that. So how do homes ignite? Now that we know what fire looks like in the state and some challenges with firefighting, I want to start getting into how homes ignite and things you can do to lessen the chance that your home will ignite in the case of a wildfire. But before I do that, I want to see what you guys think. So if we could put up that first poll, and the question is, what is the main reason, or what is the main way that homes ignite during a wildfire? Is it flying embers, direct flame contact, or radiant heat? And Bill, you can give about 30 seconds to answer this. So I see about 13 people have voted. Okay. Most of you said flying embers, and that is correct. A common misconception that I admit I was guilty of thinking is that direct flame contact or radiant heat was the main way that homes are ignited, and that is not true. There has been some research done and some on-the-ground observations that show that the main fire front, or this main flame, sorry, the poll keeps popping up. The main fire front, or the flame that moves through an area, only lasts about 1 to 10 minutes depending on the vegetation type. And so it is not the main cause of home ignitions. These little flying embers are actually the main cause. And flying embers are a big concern because they can fasten they make a wildfire spread quickly because they fly through the air and land on things and create these little spot fires. So it allows the fire to move more rapidly by creating smaller fires in front of the main fire. When you see or when you experience a direct flame contact, it's when you have trees or some type of vegetation directly next to your home that's touching your home. And say some of those trees or vegetation start on fire, that fire can then move to your home and ignite it. Radiant heat, all the way over here on the right, it acts as a preheater. So all of these trees in between the fire and the house are getting preheated from this flame, which is essentially drying the trees out so that they can ignite quicker and move the flame towards the house faster. So those are the 3 ways that homes ignite. And an important thing to think about is the more vegetation that you have surrounding the home, and especially this continuous, everything is touching each other, the more fuel, the more there can be a fire. Oops. So you may be thinking at this point, with your home or cabin or property, am I at risk? And I want to go through just a few questions to put this into context. So in asking these questions, think about your home or your second home and the property that's surrounding it. And when we say, is your home at risk or is your property at risk, we're talking about a few different things. The first one is the physical attributes of your home and property that put it at risk to damage from wildfire. Another thing is how your location impacts you. So we talked about the rural areas, and we're going to get more into some of the geography and specifics of how your location impacts you. And then last, how do your actions or the actions of those around you impact your risk? So is your home in a rural area? We talked about rural areas as far as response time. And another important thing about rural areas is they tend to be less accessible. So the roads can be more narrow, they can be more winding, and they can be built from softer materials, excuse me, which can cause equipment to get stuck and increase response time quite a bit. Is your home in a wooded area? Homes in wooded areas are more flammable because they have live fuels and dead fuels. So live fuels are those trees that we saw in the slide before, the trees standing next to the house, they're alive. It's a source of live fuel. The dead fuels would be the leaves or the pine needles, pine cones that fall off of those trees and land on the ground. So the trees could have a fire move through them towards the home, and the ground with the dead, dry vegetation could have a fire move across it towards the home. Do you see, when you look out your window, do you see more pine needles and leaves than lawn? If you do, for one, that means you have more dry dead fuels on the ground, which could sustain a ground fire. But it also could mean that you live in an area that has sandy soils and more dry, flammable tree species like pine and oak. And when you see pine needles and leaves more than lawn, it's an indicator that you probably live in a more flammable area than some of your counterparts in areas of the state where they see more lawn and have more lush vegetation. And last, does burning take place on your property or some of your neighbor's property? We had talked about, ash disposal and burning some legal or illegal materials on your property, but in essence, the more burning that happens as far as the leaves, brush, lawn debris, the more chances a fire could escape or an ember could fly off and start a spot fire. Now that we've started to talk about ways to think about if your property or home is at risk, I want to jump into some of the checks that you can do to your driveway, your home and cabin, and your property. And this is not a complete list. We did send a checklist in the registration email if you'd like to have a more comprehensive list. And then at the end of this presentation, we're also going to send a link for a DNR pamphlet on creating a zone around your home and property that helps you be more prepared for fire. And just quickly, I want to remind us that there are 3 ways that homes ignite: flying embers, direct flame, and radiant heat. So let's just try and keep that in mind as we move through these images and look at some of the hazards that you can see on your, around your house or on your property. When you look at your driveway and you think about the riskiness or the chance of having damage from wildfire, you want to think about 2 things. The first is, do you have enough accessibility for equipment and crews to move through? And to have accessibility, you need to have a driveway that's at least 12 feet wide and 14 feet tall. And 14 feet tall means that you don't have any branches or tree limbs hanging down below 14 feet that could obstruct some of these crews from accessing your property. And the second thing is visibility. You want to have preferably a reflective sign, but definitely a visible, clear sign with your house number, because some of these fires, especially on the more wooded properties in rural areas, might not be visible from the road. And the more time that the crew has to spend figuring out which house they're supposed to go to, the more time that the fire has to spread. And Andy, I think you just had an issue with this, what was it, last year?
Yeah, last fall, we had a fire called in. We couldn't find the house. There was no house number at the town road. Then when we finally found where we were going, the driveway was so narrow and grown in, we couldn't drive our pickup trucks with our fire equipment in, let alone a heavy unit with a bulldozer. And we ended up having to carry hand tools and backpack spray cans in. We went in about a mile to get to this fire, and then when we got to the fire, we found that there was a creek there. So then we had to send somebody back out to hustle in a pump so we could start a pump to have more water than what we had in our backpacks to get to the property. So it is really important and critical that you do have your fire numbers accessible and that your road is improved enough to get equipment back to your site if you were to ever have a fire.
Thanks for that, Andy. All right, let's move on to the home and cabin checks. Again, there are a lot of things that you can do to check your home or your second home or cabin, but I want to highlight just a couple of the key actions that you can take to check your house or cabin to see how risky it is. And the first one is look at your roof and gutters. So this image, we have not a ton, but there's quite a bit of leaves collecting on the roof as well as in the gutter. And if we remember the main ways that structures ignite is in a flying ember. And so a flying ember landing on a structure like this with enough dead fuel, leaves, pine cones, etc., could ignite the structure itself. So you want to make sure that you're checking and keeping those things clear of flammable debris. And another big one is make sure you don't have firewood or other flammable debris within 30 feet of your home. So in this image on the left, we can see, they have firewood, and I totally understand you want to keep it close by for the winter so you're not trudging through the snow. But once the snow is gone, really consider moving that away so that there's less fuel on your deck in this case, or within 30 feet of your home for one of those embers to ignite it. And another, if you can see in this photo, another hazard would be all that flammable debris that's under the deck. So if that were to catch fire, it probably wouldn't be too difficult to catch the stairs on fire because they're wood, and the deck is also wood. There's quite a bit of wood going on here, so it would not take much for a small ember to ignite and continue to move through the structure. And then you really also want to focus on looking at the first 3 to 5 feet of your home and remove anything that can burn. So this is a great example of property where some xeriscaping, putting down some rocks, was replacing some of this old, what looks like definitely dead leaves, but also some dried out shrubs that are just acting as a potential fuel source. And so in the photo on the right, you can see that there are some shrubs, but they are much more healthy and they're spread apart so they're not touching and acting as a continuous fuel source. And when you look at your yard as a whole, or your property, you want to create 30 feet of defensible space. And what defensible space means is that a crew and or its equipment could easily, or it could move through the 30 feet surrounding your home to be able to defend that home and the property. And a good rule of thumb to go by is the motto of lean, clean, and green. And what we mean by lean is lean vegetation. So you'll notice before that fence, the trees are well enough apart that the crowns likely aren't touching and acting as one of those continuous fuel sources. Beyond the fence, they are more tightly packed and the crowns are touching, but we're not concerned about that area because it's beyond the 30 feet to get started with mitigating. So that's what lean means. You also want to make sure that you have trees and shrubs that are pruned so that they aren't touching the ground, and you don't have a case where there's dead fuel on the ground and then a live fuel and they're touching and can act as another continuous fuel. Clean involves cleaning all of the dead plant material from around the first 30 feet. So in the last slide we saw there was quite a bit of leaf litter and some dead vegetation next to the home, which would be considered clean. You want to clean that stuff out. Keep the yard raked, free of pine needles and pine cones and all of those other flammable debris. And then finally, green means keeping the vegetation and the trees healthy and green year round, and water if necessary, but definitely keep the grass mowed and watered. And Andy, did you have anything to add here?
Yeah, just in the spring of the year when fire dangers are high, if you keep your yard raked and clean, it's one of the first things that green up is going to be your yard. And if you were to have a wildfire, having that yard greened up would immensely slow the fire, if not stop it completely. from even coming close to your property or your structure. So just simple things like giving your yard a rake in the spring to help it green up quicker um, could ultimately save a structure.
Thanks, Andy. All right, and finally, you want to check for other hazards. And one of the common other hazards, especially maybe as you get further north, is a propane tank. And in the case of a propane tank, you want to be sure that you don't have temporary structures like this lean-to next to it, or a big flammable wood pile. Want to make sure that it's kind of a standalone unit with nothing flammable around it. And that also includes, you can see there's some dead leaf litter around the propane tank, and it looks like maybe some dried out shrubs growing around it. So the lean and clean also applies to propane tanks. Okay, so we've talked about how to check your driveway, how to check your home, and how to check your property to see if there are wildfire hazards. And now we're going to take a little quiz. So the first quiz, if we could go ahead and put that poll up, is what do you see? And I want you to think about what we just talked about and tell me how many wildfire hazards you see when you look at this picture. And we can give everybody about 30 seconds again to answer. And if you're busy thinking about pizza, I completely understand. It's fine. Thanks, Bill. Okay, most of you said 4, and I also see 4. So let's quickly talk about those. Oops, keep clicking that space bar. All right, the first one I see is, if you actually look a little bit above that red arrow, it looks to me like those tree crowns or tree branches are touching the home, which could be the source of a direct flame contact between the tree and the house. Also with the trees, you know, those ones are definitely within the first 30 feet of the home and are not too far apart. So those crowns are touching, and those are acting as a continuous fuel source. And with those pines, you get quite a bit of dry needles and cones on the ground. So there's quite a bit of some of those dry fuels within the first 3 to 5 feet, maybe within the first 30 feet of the home. And one that we didn't talk about, but I guess everybody noticed, most people noticed, was there's a gap beneath that deck. And what's a concern here is that there's all of that dry, dead fuel, assuming that it doesn't get cleaned up and it makes its way through wind underneath the deck. If an ember were to land on some of those pine needles and it were to creep underneath the deck, if there's enough fuel under there, it could ignite the deck and move to the structure. So that's something that you definitely want to consider is if you have a deck or a structure like that, either having it closed off underneath or regularly cleaning the dead leaf litter underneath it. All right, let's take a look at the second one. Go ahead and launch the poll. Same question. Let me know how many hazards you see in this picture. Okay, so many of you said 2 and quite a few of you said 4. I tricked you a little bit here because there's another one here that we didn't cover, but I'm going to cover it now. So I keep pushing the space bar. We have a wooden deck attached to a wooden home. And then the one that I didn't talk about is cedar shake or wood shake shingles, which are extremely flammable. And I actually did some wildfire research in Utah with people that lived in a very flammable area that had experienced fire over and over. And one of the really interesting things that I found out is many of these folks replaced their cedar shake with a metal roof. And ironically, they used the cedar shake as fire starter because they said it was the best fire starter that they didn't have to buy. So if you imagine that the best fire starter you don't have to buy is attached to your roof, it's pretty at risk. So that's a one we hadn't talked about yet. And then the last one is that space between the ground and the structure. So again, it looks like there's some dead vegetation or dry fuels around this structure, and if they were to ignite and move under, this probably would not survive, if I had to guess, based on the fact that it's made almost entirely of wood. So we're going to do one more quiz question. Same question. Let me know how many hazards you see in this picture. Okay, so similar to before, I kind of tricked you. There's one here that we didn't talk about, and that is the fact that this house looks like it's on a hill, and fire moves upward pretty quick. So it actually looks like this has already been burnt based on how dark that ground is. And then there's kind of a hard break line where it looks like the fire went out. But fire does move uphill. So having your home on a hillside puts you at more of a risk. Second one, we've seen this before. So we have a wooden deck, it looks like, attached to a wooden structure. And surrounding that are some pretty tightly packed trees and vegetation. So quite a few risks here. Some of these are things that you could do mitigation to and change. Obviously, you're probably not going to change the entire structure, but being that it's on a hillside, you could consider clearing out more of this vegetation and definitely planting some grasses and trying to keep them watered so that there isn't as much dead fuel on the ground. And with that, before we end tonight, I want to point out some other important resources. I've talked a few times about the DNR website and the search bar. It is, honestly, it's a wonderful resource. If you type in even just wildfire, you'll get that data that we looked at earlier where it shows you some of the fire activity. But they also have everything from fire-resistant building materials to this second bullet point, the home ignition zone self-assessment. And if we could go ahead and put the link to that in the chat box, that's one of the many resources on the DNR site, and that will give you some tangible things that you can work on with your home and property to put your risk level, reduce your risk level, excuse me. Another thing, we've talked before in our classes about the property walkthroughs, and I think this is one of those things where if you have, a checklist and a pamphlet, you can do quite a bit and you can identify a lot of hazards. But when it comes to especially the woodland part, DNR walkthroughs could help you identify some areas where you could do some specific woodland mitigation, like creating some buffer strips and some other things to help kind of break down that fuel source that is your forest. And then the last thing is consider contacting your local foresters. So both the Forest Service and the DNR folks are happy to talk to you about wildfire risk and things that you can do to lower the risk to your home and property. And Andy, I want to give you another chance to jump in here if there's anything you'd like to talk about.
Okay. So yeah, a walkthrough is a great time to ask questions of us. You know, I've done it on several walkthroughs where people ask, "Hey, what's a fire danger around my cabin?" You know, I don't come up here very often. Can you address some issues you see here? And so we're more than happy to help you with that. Um, Also, you know, if we were to come and do like a planting plan, like we've talked about in the past, we can talk about, you know, species prone to fire and how to establish and maintain a burn break around a plantation of pine you might do, um, or things like that. So by all means, don't be afraid to reach out to your local DNR forester. We're here to help in any way we can, and so reach out to us, give us a call. We're happy to stop over and walk you through some of these things.
Thanks, Andy. With that, I'd like to say a big thank you to the DNR, and specifically, we have Jolene Ackerman on the call as well as Andy Nault, and just a big thank you for helping put the content together for this presentation, and looking forward to see what kind of questions we got.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lauren. That presentation really got me thinking about my property in a different way, and I think it was a good way to help people think about, you know, analyzing their own situation. Um, Again, I want to encourage folks to use the chat feature. It looks like we've got about 15 minutes left here. There wasn't any questions posted in the chat box that we didn't cover in the talk. I did have one question for you, Lauren, and Andrew as well. And you talked a lot about protecting your property from wildfire risk. And I'm just curious, from kind of the standpoint of forest health and timber production and wildlife, what are some of the impacts of wildfire, both positive and negative?
As far as to wildlife, you said? Sorry, it's a little hard to hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, the impacts on timber or forest health in general, or wildlife on wildfire.
Yeah, Andy, you may be able to talk a little bit more in depth, but as far as forest health, there are some definite benefits from fire. There are species that are dependent on fire and actually need fire to sustain a healthy woods. There are impacts to wildlife I'm less familiar with. I do know, similar to the trees, there are some wildlife that are dependent, or they come in after a wildfire, which is why folks at Pigeon Hunt like to burn fields. But Andy, you may be able to speak a little bit more about that.
Well, I can tell you that if you were to have a wildfire go through your property, that does greatly devalue your wood. Um, Having formerly worked for a mill, it takes a lot more chemical and stuff to bleach out charred wood. So your wood value will go down if you can sell it at all. Uh, it it doesn't necessarily affect wildlife so much, maybe temporarily, but like when we do prescribed burns, say on the spread eagle barrens, it does create better habitat for some wildlife after the burns because you're getting fresh new green vegetation.
Okay,
And
great.
you're also
Thank you.
eliminating invasives as well. So
Okay. We are getting some more questions in. Marilyn asked if there's an issue using bark in flower beds near the house. Usually it's not dry, and Jolene had commented that it's not recommended to use wood mulch in the area 3 to 5 feet around the home. Are there maybe some other recommendations for materials people could use instead?
Yeah, that's a tricky one because mulch is so popular, and it doesn't, I see you said it's usually not dry. That's true. It does tend to still be a drier source. I have seen more xeriscaping than anything, which is just people putting stone and shrubs, kind of like what we saw in that image. As far as flower beds, I am not familiar with something that could be used in the place of bark or mulch. Andy or Jolene, feel free to jump in with some suggestions. Because flower beds are pretty specific. I don't know that I'd put stone in them, but maybe some people do.
Hey, this is Jolene. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hey, Jolene.
Oh, hi. Yeah, so like if a flower bed is an island, meaning that it's away from the home, you're welcome to use all the mulch that you want. That it's just that area 3 to 5 feet around the home that's the most susceptible to having embers land in a dry mulch bed, and then that ignites, and then you have direct flame contact right next to the siding. So if you were to use any kind of mulch, a rock mulch would be the preferred. But really, you don't necessarily want to have a flower bed right next to the house anyways, because once that material dries out, then it can be an ignition source right next to the house. So a lot of people who are really mindful of their firewise practices, they'll just fill in that area around the house with either some stone pavers or rock mulch, or they'll just leave it as either dirt or grass, and then have their flower beds somewhere else away from the home or in like an island, in the lawn.
Another, speaking of just leaving the dirt, I've seen where I think it's called a live edge or edging. So they'll leave dirt, but there's a hard edge that a landscaping company can drive between the dirt and the grass. So it creates a different texture and it looks very nice.
Yeah, I've seen that option too. I know what you mean. It really is a unique and attractive option.
Thank you very much for jumping in, Jolene.
Sure.
Looks like we've got another question about disposing of hot ash from the fireplace and wood stove, and maybe some best practices around disposal of that hot ash. And Jolene has commented in the chat box, but maybe we could just talk about that a little bit so we've got it on the recording.
Yeah, go ahead, Jolene, take it away.
Sure. So we are seeing ash disposal caused fires more and more, especially as people are heating with either outdoor furnaces or wood fireplaces or wood stoves in their house. And a lot of times that you'll see people, they'll dump wood ash like close to the property line or a little bit. They don't venture too far from their house. So it's another instance where when ash is dumped, there's embers that are still smoldering in that ash. It takes just a little bit of a breeze to blow the top layer of ash off, and then it exposes those embers. And since the embers have been dumped just a little ways off the property, they tend to be in an area where there's pine needles or dead leaves, and then that material gets ignited. And then you have flames that are going to be snaking around the property or over to the neighbor's property. So the preferred method is like if you had a metal bucket that you could put ash in with a tight fitting lid, so you're going to remove oxygen from that ash. So that's one thing, and then you could feel the metal side to make sure that it's cool to the touch. So you can feel fairly confident that it's going to have extinguished all the embers. So that when you do take it outdoors and you dump it outside, maybe an old or somewhere that you would then wet it, grab the closest stick, stir it a little bit to make sure there aren't any still in there, maybe wet it down again, so you can really feel confident that when you walk away that it's not going to reignite.
Thanks, Jolene.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I see Lauren just, again, put the pamphlet for fire-resistant buildings into the chat feature here, and then we've got the link again for the YouTube channel where this presentation will be recorded. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat box. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to touch on, Lauren. We do have a couple minutes left.
No, just in case the pamphlet doesn't work, some of the more common fire resistant or less flammable materials for building that I've seen are brick, stucco, and out west I've even seen concrete homes. So those are just a few of the popular options that are available.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again, and thank you, Andrew and Jolene, and thanks to Bill for doing the backup work here. And with that, I think we're going to conclude tonight's class. So thanks for attending, everybody. We have our last two classes coming up next week. Obviously, you guys have all seen the registration information since you're here tonight, so I encourage you to tune in next week, where we'll be here Monday and Tuesday at 7 p.m. So thanks again, and have a good night, everybody.